Production records from Belhaven Plantation reveal an unthinkable spike in cotton yields in the spring of 1841 beneath the moss-covered oaks of Wilcox County, Alabama. A 47% rise that defied all agricultural rationalizations at the time, the cost of that prosperity for 23 enslaved men, and the reasons why 17 of them would die within 8 months under conditions the county coroner refused to record, are not disclosed in the ledgers. The descendants of the Granger family have preserved a set of letters that reveal a system of rewards and penalties for more than a century and 8 decades. Disturbing, it calls into question how we perceive the Antebellum South's power, desperation, and human depravity. Tonight, we learn the truth about what transpired behind Belhaven's white columns, where brutality masqueraded as kindness and ambition donned silk. I want you to do something before we go on to the tale of Belhaven Plantation and its widowed mistress. If you're as fascinated as I am by tales like this, by gloomy periods of American history that defy burial, click the subscribe button now. And here's something that interests me. Tonight, where are you listening from? Leave your city or state in the comments section below. I'd like to know the extent of these forgotten horrors in America. Let's travel back in time to 1841 Alabama, when human souls were the currency of advancement and cotton was the dominant crop. The Black Belt in Alabama got its name from the rich dark dirt that covered for those with the means to take advantage of it, the central area is like a ribbon of opportunity. Wilcox County was among the wealthiest cotton-producing regions in the South by 1841. Slave labor and the aspirations of the plantation aristocracy, who saw themselves as American royalty, were the only foundations of its economy. Scattered across almost 2,000 acres of this desirable property, Belhaven Plantation was situated at a slender bend of the Alabama River, where steamboats could stop and pick up bales of cotton headed for New Orleans and Mobile. The house was 3 floors high. A testament to wealth amassed over many centuries of ruthless efficiency is its Greek Revival architecture. The Granger family had hosted senators, governors, and cotton factors who shaped the region's economic destiny on a wraparound veranda supported by white columns. However, Belhaven was placed under peculiar management in February 1841. Constance Granger, only 28 years old, had become the sole owner of the plantation after her husband, William Granger III, died suddenly from what the family doctor tactfully described as an apoplexy of the brain during a particularly heated dispute with a rival planter over water rights. Following William's death, Constance found herself in a vulnerable situation, a young widow with no male heirs, significant debts her late husband had hidden, and a plantation workforce that many people thought no woman could effectively oversee. The prevailing belief in Alabama society in 1841 was that a woman in Constance's position ought to promptly get married again or choose a male supervisor to manage the harsh requirements of plantation lifetime administration. Her neighbors thought she would fail in a season. Preston Granger, her own brother-in-law, had already started spreading the word that Belhaven would have to be sold to pay off Williams's debts, putting himself in a position to buy the property for a small portion of its true value. But by following the rules, Constance Granger had not made it through 28 years in the brutal world of plantation life. She was born Constance Dalton in Charleston, and her father, a shipping merchant, had given her an exceptionally good education for a lady of her day. Required that his girls study accountancy and mathematics in addition to French and needlework. She knew that her life hinged on achieving production levels that would silence all critics and guarantee her independence, and she could calculate profit margins as precisely as any other factor in Mobile. In February 1841, there were 63 slaves living at Belhaven, who were split between field laborers, domestic helpers, and skilled workers who ran the plantation's carpentry, gin, and cotton shops. Belhaven had functioned under harsh overseers who used systematic brutality to maintain discipline, in contrast to many plantations. William Greer's specific theory of measurable incentive, which provided people who went above quotas more food, better clothes, or minor benefits. Constance, however, realized that her late husband's modest incentives had only led to modest outcomes, and as a result, she would lose everything she had married into. William's remaining debts came to around $8,000, which could only be paid off by a significant boost in cotton production. She required her employees to produce not just enough but exceptionally well, and she needed it right away. Silas Drummond, A wiry 45-year-old who had overseen Belhaven's field operations for 7 years, lived in the overseer's hut at the edge of the quarters. Drummond was an example of the standard overseer class. The planter aristocrats itself were firmly subordinated to the poor white men who held power over enslaved laborers. He had anticipated that Constance would respect his opinion on all agricultural issues and possibly even give him more power while Williams was away. Rather, in their initial private, Constance had met with Drummond in the plantation office and told him that his services would only be retained if production rose by 40% prior to the summer harvest. As he explained that such numbers were unachievable without practically working people to death, the overseer had looked at her in shock and said that doing so would only lower the plantation's long-term value. Then, with a smile that never made it to her beautiful blue eyes, Constance had informed Drummond that she had her own ideas, ones that would call for his participation and silence, but not necessarily his comprehension. Later, the supervisor would, in a letter found decades after these incidents, he told his wife that Constance Granger's voice that day had chilled him to the bone. Not rage or insanity, but a confidence that she had already estimated expenses he couldn't fathom. Drummond oversaw 23 men who were enslaved and labored in the cotton fields at Belhaven. Their bodies bore the scars of a lifetime of grueling work, and they ranged in age from 16 to 52. Similar to slaves across the South, they had within the nightmare of their lives. They created their own social structures, hierarchies, and survival strategies. A 34-year-old man named Isaac was born in Belhaven and was well versed in its disciplines. Caleb, a 19-year-old who had just been bought from a Georgia farm that had failed, was still getting used to his new jail. There was Samuel, 41, who was valuable enough to escape the harshest penalties due to his ability to determine the best time to harvest. Every man carried with him his own tale of grief, resiliency, and the daily struggle to make it through another day of bondage. These individuals were aware of the harsh math involved in plantation life. Never work so hard as to raise quotas to unachievable levels, just hard enough to avoid penalty. Generations of slavery had honed this delicate balance, a method of resistance through measured acquiescence. Constance Granger, however, was set to add a factor to this equation in March 1841 that would completely destroy all of the survival tactics these men had established. In a system that was set up to deprive them of all three, she was going to provide them with an offer that would take advantage of the most fundamental human needs: desire, hope, and the appearance of agency. Warm winds brought by the early arrival of spring 1841 in Wilcox County helped the cotton plants thrive and created ideal growing conditions. Constance started carrying out her plan in the large house with meticulous accuracy, beginning with minor adjustments that appeared to be quite innocuous to onlookers. Younger laborers from the fields took the place of the elderly housekeepers who had worked for the family for decades. Anyone walking past the main house could see her eating her evening meals by herself on the veranda. Deep burgundies and forest greens, which suggested a woman already looking past sadness, were the new outfits she bought from Mobile instead of the mourning black that widowhood required. Constance ignored the spouses of the nearby planters as they discussed their scandals in whispers over tea. She wasn't entertaining them. Every decision and obvious alteration was made with a completely different audience in mind. She required more labor from the men than she could have ever imagined. The events that transpired at Belhaven Plantation would go down in Wilcox County folklore, a tale too unsettling to tell in detail, but too tenacious to forget entirely. It was a system that would, in fact, yield unthinkable results, but at a price that would reverberate for generations and prompt inquiries into the most sinister aspects of human nature when authority is challenged. The modification started after the work week concluded on a Saturday night in late March, and the slave population assembled in the quarters for a quick repose before Sunday's half-day off. With a strange statement, Silas Drummond emerged, his voice echoing throughout the cabins on the crowded earth. "A new system of rewards has been implemented by Mistress Granger," he said, his uneasiness showing in his refusal to look people in the eyes. "The man who selects the most cotton each week will be given a unique privilege if he surpasses his quota by the largest amount." The folks in the crowd looked at each other suspiciously. They had already heard promises of benefits, extra rations that never came, and privileges that were taken away as soon as they were given. Hope itself was frequently just another kind of brutality in the economy of slavery. "However," Drummond went on, his tone becoming softer. Saturday night will be spent in the main house with the man who produces the most. In the quarters of Mistress Greer's, the hush that ensued was complete at her invitation. Even the kids ceased their games. Every social boundary that governed plantation life seemed to be broken by the words, which seemed impossible. A meticulously crafted mythology of virtue and purity surrounded white women of the planter class. The same ideology that served as justification for the entire racial enslavement system. Basic presumptions were upended by the idea that a plantation mistress would voluntarily and openly give herself to enslaved men. But Drummond was far from done. Every Saturday morning, production numbers will be displayed. The winner will be announced in private and is anticipated at the main house following dinner. Tonight is when this starts. This week, Isaac picked 347, which is 23% more than he needed to. At 8 quar, he is expected to show up at the main house's rear entrance. Around him, Isaac, a sturdy man with hands worn from decades of cotton picking and graying temples, remained motionless. Others took a small step back as though being close to him had suddenly become dangerous. This discrepancy could represent a variety of things in the social calculus of servitude, most of which would be dangerous. "This is a trick," a whisper went forth. "They'll hang him for it." However, as 8 quar drew near, Isaac was led to the main house's back entrance where Constance Granger was waiting, rather than to a noose or a whipping post. Her auburn hair fell loosely about her shoulders in a garment of rich green silk, a look that no dignified widow should flaunt. Her face was lit by a single lamp, and she had no reluctance or embarrassment on her face. "Isaac," she uttered plainly, her voice retaining the same calm assurance it usually has. The rooms were filled with agonizing speculation about what transpired over those hours. "You've earned this reward. Come inside." Men prodded Isaac for details as he emerged close to dawn and made his way back toward the cottages in the early morning darkness. However, Isaac's expression had changed into an unintelligible form. Not quite pride, not quite shame, but a complex mashup of feelings that were difficult to pin down. He started to say she, but stopped. "Everything went according to plan. She treated me as if I were a man who had merited something, as if my worth extended beyond my work." The meaning of the words, which hung in the air, made everyone uneasy in a society that treated people like property, that denied enslaved men the right to want or dignity. Something that seemed almost like recognition had been delivered by Constance. It was never freedom, but a perverted recognition of humanity that was in some ways more unsettling than pure cruelty. The young man's eyes widened in a mixture of terror and something more he didn't want to mention as Caleb pressed. Isaac added softly, "Then she thanked me for my great work." She expressed her excitement about honoring outstanding performance once more the following week. And knowing what was possible, she asked me if I felt the others would put in more effort. In that question, the trap was exposed. Constance wasn't just giving anything away. In order to achieve something that combined the appearance of worth with the promise of closeness, she was establishing a system of competition that would drive these guys against one another. She was taking advantage of not only their work, but also their most basic psychological needs and their desire for any remaining human being in a system that was set up to take it away. The next week saw a sharp increase in production. Men who had been consuming 250 pounds a day suddenly started consuming 300 pounds, pushing their bodies to the brink. Everyone sensed the competition, even though it was not publicly stated. Young and powerful, Caleb motivated himself. He rushed to fill his sack before everybody else did, his fingers bleeding from the sharp cotton bolls till he was exhausted. The elder guy, Samuel, who had always been efficient rather than quick due to his experience, was forced to work through the intense noon heat that he had learnt to stay away from. Due to the obvious effort of those around them, even guys who professed to have no interest in participating in this demeaning system found themselves involuntarily accelerating. According to the posting on Saturday morning, Caleb was the week's top producer with 360 tours, which shouldn't have been achievable for someone with his relative inexperience. He also walked that evening to the main house, coming back before daybreak with Isaac's similar muddled expression. By the third week, there was no denying Belhaven's productivity turnaround. The figures in Drummond's daily totals defied all agricultural expectations. In order to have a chance on Saturday night, men were working in the fields for 12 to 14 hours, enduring fatigue and injuries. However, something else was also taking place. Something Constance may have foreseen or perhaps learned with icy satisfaction. The enslaved community's social ties Support for one another, common survival techniques, and group resistance through concerted effort started to erode. After years of working together, men now saw one another as rivals. There were little sabotages, a ripped picking bag and a lost water gourd that wasted valuable time. Arguments broke out over alleged or actual attempts to slow down or inflate data. Competitors. As the enslaved people disciplined themselves in search of Constance's reward, the overseers, who had previously battled to maintain control by violence, now observed. Constance kept thorough records on her Saturday night guests as well as the cotton production in the main house. She recorded every interaction with clinical accuracy in a leather-bound journal that would eventually be found concealed in a fake bottom of her writing desk. The psychological observations, not the personal details. Isaac will push himself to death for recurring access because he is appreciative, almost worshipful and helpful. Caleb, who is constantly seeking approval, reacts well to compliments. Biggest potential gain in productivity. Samuel struggled, embarrassed but powerless to stop. He is more valued because of this internal conflict. He will make a greater effort to defend his involvement. The journal exposed Constance's system as deliberate psychological manipulation rather than rash immorality. She had recognized that the promise of intimacy, which carried the appearance of human connection and the illusion of choice, could be used to manipulate enslaved men who had been deprived of all other forms of agency and dignity. Her actions were motivated by a brutal awareness of how to take advantage of other people's desire rather than by desire herself. 17 distinct males had won their Saturday night several times by mid-April. Periods. Written comments questioned the accuracy of the production figures. Constance gave to her cotton factors in Mobile because they were so remarkable. The figures were validated when factor representatives came to check. In fact, Belhaven was producing at previously unheard-of quantities. However, additional alterations were also observed by those visitors. The population of enslaved people was oddly split, without the typical indicators of a group's identity. Instead of working in a rhythm of cooperation, men labored with solitary drive. There was no longer the chanting that usually accompanied fieldwork, simply the terrible silence of cotton being ripped from plants with frantic haste. In a letter to his wife, one of the visitors, Robert Hriss from Mobile, stated that the environment at Belhaven felt unwholesome, as though a fever had seized the workers, pushing them to be productive while depleting their souls of something vital. Hriss could not have envisaged the real cause of that fever, nor could he have recognized how precise his evaluation was, since the first death happened by the end of April. A 36-year-old man called Joseph passed out in the field during the warmest period of the day. Dr. Ephraim Caldwell, the plantation doctor, ascribed death to heart failure caused by activity in extreme heat. However, Joseph's passing was noteworthy for another reason. He had spent his reward night with Constance after winning the previous Saturday. He had been heard telling others that he would win again, and that he would stop at nothing to earn another night in the main house, where he was treated like more than just property. Just 4 days before to his breakdown, the night following Joseph's burial, the rumors started in the quarters at the plantation cemetery, a separate area of the property where slaves were buried with wooden markers that hardly ever included their names. The women who had witnessed this system's development with growing worry came together to express realities that the males were still unable to accept. A 50-year-old lady named Ruth claimed she's killing them while serving in the primary residence and had witnessed more than she had desired. For a chance to feel human, they kill themselves out of desire rather than with a whip or noose. Another lady added, her voice shaking. My Thomas returned different. He won't talk about his night, but he works like a man possessed now. His hands bled through the bandages yesterday and he wouldn't stop. I asked him why, and the psychological trap Constance had set was showing its full cruelty. She had not only taken advantage of physical desire, but she had also tapped into a deeper human need for recognition, worth, and some proof that one's existence mattered beyond mere labor. In a system that reduced people to tools, she gave them a fleeting illusion of personhood before forcing them to destroy themselves and pursue it again. Ruth's observations during her work in the main house, however, added another layer of horror to Constance's system. The mistress keeps a journal, Ruth disclosed in whispered tones, and I've seen her writing in it every Sunday morning, recording details about each man who visits. The women's worries went beyond the psychological, not as lovers but as tests, as though she's researching them, assessing their level of self-determination. Everything was changed by this realization. Constance was not a widow motivated by loneliness or desire. Rather, she was studying human behavior in harsh environments methodically, and had found that the promise of intimacy and recognition could increase productivity beyond what violence alone could ever accomplish. She was recording the findings with scientific objectivity. 3 more deaths followed Joseph's as the spring turned to early summer. Each man had been a recent Saturday night visitor and had pushed himself to extraordinary production levels in the days that followed. Dr. Caldwell, becoming alarmed by the pattern, tried to talk to Constance about it. "Mrs. Granger, I must express concern," he said during a house call in late May. Constance had received him in the parlor with a perfectly composed demeanor. "Dr. Caldwell, I appreciate your concern, but surely you recognize that these men work of their own accord. I force no one beyond their natural capacity. 5 deaths in 2 months is highly unusual, even when you account for the exertions of harvest season." The doctor had no response. By the twisted logic of the system, she was right. She was offering rewards, not impossible quotas, that the men destroyed themselves pursuing those rewards, which could be framed as their choice, their weakness, their inability to resist temptation. Maybe the doctor tried carefully. "Should I punish such initiative?" Constance's voice stayed level, but her eyes held a serious expression. "The reward itself is inappropriate. A woman of your station giving such intimate details to enslaved men. The social implications alone." "The social implications, doctor, are that Belhaven will produce record yields this season, securing my financial independence and silencing those who believed a woman incapable of managing a plantation." Dr. Caldwell had retreated at the time, unwilling to publicly accuse a white woman of the planter class of purposefully engineering deaths, but he confided in his own journal, later found by historians, that he thought Constance Granger had found a way to extract maximum productivity by exploiting the base natures of enslaved men, driving them to self-destruction through the use of force. Warning: my methods are my own concern, unless you believe the deaths are caused by something other than overexertion. Constance had discovered a weakness to exploit, but it was not base nature. Rather, it was the deep human need for dignity, recognition, and worth, needs that the system of enslavement purposefully denied, and she had provided a perverse fulfillment of those needs before making the pursuit lethal. His analysis, though severely flawed by the racist presumptions of his time, contained a kernel of truth. Silas Drummond had started to crumble by June as a result of his complicity, and his wife Martha would later testify in a deposition that her husband had started drinking excessively, something he had not done much of before, and that he had nightmares and stood at the posting board every Saturday morning, knowing he was announcing a possible death sentence. "I'm tallying souls, not pounds of cotton," he told Martha one night when he was intoxicated enough to speak clearly. "She's managed to make them volunteer for their own destruction, and I'm the one who calls them to the slaughter every week by ringing the bell." "Then stop," Martha had begged. "Go. Look for another job." Constance had him trapped as surely as she had her workforce through economic necessity and the threat of ruin. But Drummond, like everyone else in the plantation economy, knew that overseers who quit were rarely hired elsewhere. During this time, Preston Granger, Williams's brother and Constance's rival for control of Belhaven, had been keeping an eye on events with increasing alarm. His initial satisfaction at anticipating Constance's failure had turned to worry as her production numbers hit previously unheard-of levels. The debts that should have compelled her to sell were being paid off quickly, and his chance to purchase Belhaven at a discount was evaporating. In early June, Preston paid a formal visit to Belhaven, supposedly to see how his late brother's widow was doing. He arrived to discover that Preston had heard the rumors going around Wilcox County society, whispers about Constance's strange methods, and the suspicious death rate among her male field workers, so he tried to find out the truth over dinner. "Your production numbers are impressive," he said, referring to the plantation's machine-like efficiency. The cotton bales stacked for transportation, the fields kept up to date, and everything that suggested exceptional management. He bit into the roasted duck she had served and remarked, "Very impressive, Constance. You could even call them miraculous. This accomplishment must undoubtedly be ascribed to some managerial innovation." "Innovative indeed," Constance said, grinning slightly. I've just discovered how to appropriately encourage my employees to provide rewards that genuinely inspire commitment to their work. Rewards. Preston left the term lingering. Regarding the nature of these incentives, I have heard some anecdotes, rumors that would embarrass the whole county if they were true. Without flinching, Constance looked him in the eye. Who told the stories, Preston? By jealous rivals, by those who take offense at a woman's success when they foresaw failure. I provide little privileges, extra meals, better clothes, and awards for outstanding effort. It is their corruption, not mine, if scandalmongers turn these harmless gestures into something improper. Deniability was the genius of her position. The enslaved men themselves, whose testimony had no legal weight, the overseer, who was complicit, and the house staff, who could all testify against her, could all publicly explain her system in ambiguous, acceptable words while actually putting something far more exploitative into reality. Be sold or dismissed at her discretion. That night, dissatisfied and suspicious but without hard proof of wrongdoing, Preston left Belhaven. The mechanics of what Constance was doing were in a morally and legally ambiguous area, even if he had proof. Instead of punishing people, she was rewarding them. The law was ill-prepared to handle the complexity that the incentive. Preston Granger, however, was far from done. He started his covert investigation by talking to doctors, factors, nearby overseers, and anybody else who could know something about Constance's strategies. In an attempt to discredit Constance and gain control of Belhaven, he began to piece together bits and pieces of the story, including the Saturday night visits, the competitive fervor in the fields, and the growing death toll. Preston was still unaware that Constance had been getting ready for just such a danger. Every aspect of her system had been evaluated for defensibility as well as productivity. Furthermore, she had previously taken precautions to guarantee that any inquiry would only turn up information that she desired, not much more. Preston's efforts, legal actions, or any other kind of traditional exposure would not reveal the truth about Belhaven. It would come from a source nobody could have predicted, one of the guys who had been both a victim and a participant in Constance's experiment within the system itself. Isaac had prevailed. By mid-June, he had won the Saturday Award 7 times, more than any other man. His cotton output, which seemed to defy physical reality, had become legendary on the property. However, his weight loss, the tremor that had grown in his hands, and the way his eyes had taken on a fevered look that never really went away, were all signs of the cost. As the other slaves saw Isaac, they were both amazed and horrified. He had taken on the appearance of an incarnation of the whole twisted system, the best evidence of what such achievement required, and the ultimate demonstration that Constance's incentives could propel a man to exceptional achievement. However, Isaac was also starting to grasp something Constance had not expected. He had seen things during those 7 Saturday evenings, during the few hours when he was not considered property. In order to retain the power dynamic even in intimate situations, Constance was cautious to play her part during these interactions. Small details, however, including tidbits of speech or haphazardly displayed documents, got through. There were times when her calculating exterior faltered a little. Isaac had occasionally examined the journal before his visits, but he had only seen its existence, not its contents, kept on Constance's bedside table. Once, he had overheard her talking to herself in a way that was not intended for him to hear. If current 17 deaths are anticipated by August, rates persist. Reasonable losses in comparison to anticipated yields. Isaac had been hit like a physical blow by the discovery. His excellence was not bringing him rewards. His eventual death was already built into her forecasts, and he was taking part in a planned system of exploitation. She had determined that the profit outweighed the expense because she was aware of the effects her incentives were having on him and all of them. Something changed in Isaac's comprehension at that precise instant. Anger, a completely other emotion, abruptly crystallized from the guilt, pride, and intense hunger that had pushed him to kill himself in order to get Constance's recognition. In 1841, however, anger was of no service to an enslaved man in Alabama. Death by hanging or worse would result from direct confrontation. With hostile area around it, escape from the center of plantation country was all but impossible. Hundreds of miles, Isaac required something more nuanced, a means of revealing the truth that would both protect him and destroy Constance. He started planning with the same meticulous attention to detail that Constance had applied when building her system. and his strategy focused on Preston Granger, the only person with the drive and authority to overthrow Constance. Communication was the problem. It was not enough for an enslaved guy to just go up to a white planter and accuse a white woman. His statements would be rejected regardless of their veracity, and such a presumption would result in harsh punishment. Isaac wanted a way to keep his own deniability while still giving Preston information. Literacy, a perilous secret that Isaac had concealed for the majority of his life, provided the answer. Prior to being sold to Belhaven as a young man, his former owner had been a remarkably forgiving Quaker who, in spite of state laws that specifically prohibited it, had unlawfully taught reading and writing to a number of his enslaved servants because he felt it was his moral obligation, knowing that literacy increased the value of enslaved people while simultaneously making them more dangerous in the eyes of white society. Isaac had carefully guarded this knowledge. That prohibited ability now served as his weapon. Isaac wrote a letter over the course of several weeks in late June, while working in the cabin he shared with 3 other guys in low light. His handwriting was meticulously modified to give the impression that it was written by an educated, possibly white person. Constance's system was described in clinical detail in the letter. The Saturday prizes, the competitive environment, the growing death toll, and, most incriminating of all, the fact that she kept a journal throughout the experiment. The letter ended with a straightforward recommendation. To verify these assertions, compare cotton output statistics with the male field death rate. Employees, there will be no denying the connection, and look through the mistress's rooms for a leather-bound journal that documents her systematic exploitation, and is probably hidden. It took assistance to get the letter to Preston. Isaac recruited Caleb, whose youth made him reckless enough to take chances and desperate enough to believe in change, having won his own Saturday prizes 3 times. Together, they planned for Preston to find the letter when he returned to Belhaven, tucking it inside his coat pocket as it hung in the foyer, so that he wouldn't see it until he had left. The land. The strategy was successful. That night, Preston discovered the letter, read it with increasing surprise, and started looking into its allegations right once. When analyzed methodically, the relationship between output and fatalities was indisputable, and Preston had enough social standing to ask Dr. Caldwell for a private meeting, during which the doctor grudgingly verified his own conclusions regarding the death pattern. However, the journal would necessitate direct intervention. Preston couldn't just go into Constance's personal space and insist on searching it. In order to obtain legal authority, he had to involve the county sheriff and risk causing a public scandal that may harm the Granger family's reputation, just as much as it did Constance's. Preston pondered his options during restless evenings. In addition to being convincing, the evidence was extremely unsettling. If the allegations in the letter were accurate, Constance had managed to turn intimacy into a weapon, turning the promise of human connection into a more potent exploitation instrument than a whip. The ramifications of Constance's actions and what they disclosed about the system of slavery itself were profound. The situation at Belhaven was rapidly approaching a crisis while Preston considered. The Saturday contests had become more and more frantic as men battled more desperately for prizes. Small wounds that employees would typically heal had lost all significance. Men with wounds, fevers, and broken fingers who should have stayed in their huts picked cotton. Something extraordinary occurred on the first Saturday in July. Isaac and Daniel, a younger man who had just developed an obsession with winning the Saturday prize, tied for the highest production. Each had merited the honor by the rigorous standards of Constance's system. Unable to handle the situation, Drummond brought it up to Constance. She came up with a brutal solution. Both men would receive rewards, but it was obvious that they would do so sequentially. Isaac on Saturday night and Daniel on Sunday. Sunday's award, a second-place finish that came with its own embarrassment, was somehow less worthwhile. Daniel, motivated by the following week, driven by ego and the perverted logic of competition, he defied all reason in an attempt to win hands down. His output skyrocketed, but the physical cost also increased. He started coughing up blood by Thursday. He was scarcely able to stand by Friday. He was deceased on Saturday morning. As he examined the body, Dr. Caldwell lost his professional objectivity. It is obvious that Daniel's physical breakdown and weariness led to his death. Overwork actually consumed his body. Constance was confronted by the doctor in front of Drummond and a number of domestic helpers. Caldwell said, his voice trembling with fear and rage, "This has gone too far. These men are being killed by your incentives. It's not what you're giving them, worthy of their lives." The calmness of Constance's response was unsettling. "Are you saying, Dr. Caldwell, that I'm pressuring people to put in more effort than they can? Every man decides how much work he wants to put in. When I witness excellence, I simply acknowledge it. How can I be held accountable if others are unable to control their own goals?" Caldwell retorted. "You know exactly what you're doing. You've put in place a system that takes advantage of their urgent need for acceptance and humanity. You're taking advantage of their desire for respect. And who is at fault?" Constance gave a chilly response. "Because such things are what they desire for. The system that deprives children of their dignity was not created by me. Like everyone else, I just work within it. When their bodies are damaged, you tend to them. Drummond is in charge of their work. They are mine. We are all part of this machine. Doctor, don't act like I am the only one accountable for its cruelty." There was a poor logic in the argument. Constance was correct that the system she worked in was set up to exploit and demean people. Her manner was innovative, not the exploitation itself. Realizing that human promise might be more harmful than direct rejection, Ruth brought the story back to the quarters after she had seen this altercation from the doorway. Now the community of enslaved people had to face a terrible reality. Constance was well aware of her system's actions. There were no unforeseen effects or mishaps that led to the deaths. In an effort to achieve previously unheard-of levels of production, they were assessed expenses and acceptable losses. The social structure of the enslaved community in Belhaven was fundamentally disrupted by that realization. Men who had been vying for Saturday prizes started to publicly doubt their involvement. Arguments sprang out between those who were too firmly committed to the system to abandon it and those who wished to oppose it. The idea that they had given up on the competition felt like they were acknowledging that their sacrifices had been in vain, because some had based their entire sense of value on their Saturday triumphs. Isaac stared in agony as this broke apart. His scheme to reveal Constance through Preston had not yet shown results, and in the meantime, the neighborhood was disintegrating. He understood that he had to move quickly to get Preston's hand before more people died. The chance arose in mid-July when Preston returned to Belhaven, supposedly for a standard family vacation, but really to take a closer look at the plantation's activities. During Preston's arrival, Isaac was able to set up his job near the main home close enough to make eye contact and show the white guy the intellect and desperation in his eyes. A deliberate risk that, to someone already primed by the anonymous letter to seek out clues of the truth, may register as significant but, to others, could be dismissed as simple respect. Preston did notice, and that quick glance proved to him that the letter had been written by someone who knew Constance's system well from inside Belhaven itself. The insight made his investigation even more urgent. Preston could not allow that bravery to go wasted when someone was risking everything to reveal the truth. That night, Preston made up his mind. He would include James Holbrook, the county sheriff, who was notorious for his strict commitment to the law and his intense unease with anything that endangered the social order. Preston carefully phrased his request as a worry about possible financial fraud rather than an accusation of impropriety, which may make Holbrook defensive of white femininity. Preston told the sheriff, "I have reason to believe that my sister-in-law might be fabricating production records to increase Belhaven's apparent value. I ask that you come as a witness as I look over the plantation's records to make sure my late brother's estate is legitimate." It was a brilliant rephrasing. The entire plantation economy was at risk from the crime of financial fraud, something that, regardless of the accuser, required an investigation. Preston also had the legal right to review estate documents because he was a member of the family. Sheriff Holbrook consented to go with Preston the next day to Belhaven. Both men were unaware that Constance had been waiting for this very move, had been getting ready for it ever since she saw the first indications of Preston's research, and had already put her defenses in place. Constance was waiting for Preston and Sheriff Holbrook in the parlor when they arrived at Belhaven on July 18th. She was dressed in traditional mourning black and had the demeanor of a mourning widow, helping out with family matters. She gave them a respectful greeting, provided refreshments, and said she would be more than happy to open any records they wanted to look at. She said, "I have nothing to hide," with the utmost honesty. The documents will attest to my excellent administration. Please check whatever you require. Preston sensed the first glimmer of uncertainty. Constance was too willing and too composed. Someone who is guilty would exhibit signs of worry and opposition to an investigation. Nevertheless, he persisted, starting with Drummond's production ledgers. The figures were astounding. As stated in the anonymous letter, cotton yields were 47% higher than in prior years. However, the paperwork was thorough and confirmed by several people, including Drummond's signature and the enslaved laborers' marks that were used to load each bale for transportation. No indication of falsification was found, only of exceptional output. Outstanding yields, Sheriff Holbrook noted, obviously impressed. Sheriff Constance responded with ease. How did you achieve such improvement, Mrs. Granger, through proper incentives and management? I implemented a system of awards for great performance, additional rations, better clothing, and little privileges for those who went above and beyond. It has been incredibly successful. Preston took advantage of this gap. What specifically are the privileges? Constance instantly looked him in the eye. Time off from Sunday work, more food allotments, improved sleeping conditions for the most productive employees, and small gestures that recognize success without upsetting the social order. It was an outright lie. But without the enslaved workers' own testimony, it was impossible to refute. Testimony that may be thrown out as coercive or fabricated and had no legal weight. Preston attempted something different. Regarding your field workers' fatality rate, I've heard alarming reports. It seems excessive to have 17 deaths in 5 months. A tragedy, Constance said, her face suitably dejected. Every case has been reviewed by Dr. Caldwell. The reasons were organic. Heart failure, fever, and in certain situations, overwork-related fatigue. In fact, I've been worried that some of my employees are overworking themselves in an attempt to get awards. To shield them from their own overcommitment, I might have to enforce forced break periods. It was the ideal response. She admitted to the fatalities, but blamed them on the employees' own decisions, even implying that she might have to shield them from themselves. She also had the records from the doctors to back up her statements. Reports that raised concerns but refrained from charging Constance with intentional injury. Sheriff Holbrook was nodding in agreement, obviously seeing nothing wrong with this justification. Preston sensed that his case was losing ground. The production logs were correct. On the surface, Constance's explanation of her incentive scheme sounded quite fair, and the fatalities were documented with medical justifications. Preston, however, still had one more card to play. The journal. The anonymous letter claimed that it included documentation of Constance's actual method, proof that would reveal the truth behind her meticulous deceptions. I'd like to examine your personal records as well, Preston replied. Cautiously, Constance's calmness wavered just enough for Preston to notice. Any journals or private accounts you may keep regarding plantation management? For the first time, she said. Preston pressed. My personal journals? Surely that's outside the purview of looking into estate finances. Mr. Granger, do you have specific evidence that such journals exist and contain relevant information? Preston hesitated, unable to reveal the anonymous letter without casting doubt on his source. I have reason to believe you may keep detailed records of your management methods. Sheriff Holbrook now appeared uneasy, divided between his obligation to look into possible fraud and his respect for a white woman's privacy. The argument had reached a breaking point. Preston could push harder, demand a search of Constance's quarters, but that would require revealing his source, and he might still be denied by the sheriff without more specific information. Constance interrupted, her voice sharp now. If you want to accuse me of wrongdoing, do so openly, but I will not have my private chambers invaded based on gossip and rumor. Evidence. He was positive that the journal existed, but proving it was a different story. Preston was unaware that the journal had been moved 2 days prior, when Constance, expecting an investigation, had given it to Ruth, her most trusted housekeeper, with explicit instructions. Now the journal was in a place that no one would think to search. In the quarters, buried in a sealed jar under the floor of Ruth's own cabin, Constance had taken yet another precaution, creating a second journal that she kept open in her writing desk and filled with harmless observations about weather, crop development, and plantation management. If she were asked to produce a journal, she would offer this sanitized version stating that it was the only one she kept. Preston, feeling defeated but unwilling to give up completely, I tried one last time and then I said, Let me talk to your overseer and workers privately. Let me hear from them directly about these incentive programs and working conditions." Constance naturally agreed right away, "And I'm sure their testimony confirms everything I've told you. But my methods have been open and successful." When Preston questioned Drummond in the overseer's cottage that afternoon, he acknowledged the existence of reward systems, but used the same ambiguous language as Constance. Yes, workers were rewarded for exceptional production. No, nothing improper had happened. The deaths were tragic, but due to natural causes and overexertion. He was lying, or at least hiding important facts, but Drummond could not break without ruining his own livelihood and reputation. The overseer's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and Drummond's eyes showed fear. The enslaved workers were even less forthcoming when questioned, understanding the danger of speaking openly about Constance's system. Some acknowledged receiving, but when Preston spoke with Isaac, something changed. The older man's answers were carefully worded, staying within the bounds of what was safe to say, but his eyes held a message that Preston could not miss. A silent plea, a confirmation. Others denied any special privileges, and none would offer details that went against Constance's official story. "The rewards Mrs. Granger offers," Isaac said slowly, picking each word carefully, "make a man willing to work himself to death because sometimes what she gives feels more important than life itself. Because even when you know the cost, you can't stop wanting it." That the letter's accusations were true. A desperate hope that Preston would find a way to expose what words could not safely reveal. Sheriff Holbrook took Isaac's statement differently, saying, "Sounds like these workers are simply dedicated to their labor. Nothing sinister in that. But Constance was offering something more than extra rations or better quarters. She was exploiting something deeper, something that made rational men choose self-destruction." The statement was vague enough to avoid punishment, but explicit enough to confirm Preston's suspicions. "Granger, it appears to me that your sister-in-law has discovered a successful management strategy, despite some unfavorable side effects." Preston was angry and frustrated when he left Bellhaven that night. He had been sure he would uncover evidence to expose Constance, but she had foreseen every move and had put layers of protection around the truth. The journal remained hidden, the workers remained silent, and even Drummond's evident fear could not be proven as proof of wrongdoing. In the meantime, Constance privately celebrated her victory at Bellhaven, where she had successfully defended her system against investigation, maintained the facade of respectability, while preserving the reality of her methods. If he could not prove Constance's crimes through investigation, he would have to force them into the open through other means. This would require patience and careful timing, but it might finally bring the truth to light. Constance had made one crucial mistake, though, and while the Saturday rewards would continue, the productivity would continue to be extraordinary, and her financial independence would be guaranteed. She had overlooked the increasing desperation among the enslaved men themselves. As the competitions had become more frantic, the pursuit of rewards more consuming, and some men, motivated beyond reason, were starting to consider actions that would have been unthinkable months earlier, because human beings, even when exploited and controlled, eventually reach limits that no incentive can overcome. The constants that had been created with such calculated precision were getting close to breaking point. Not because of external investigation, but because of internal collapse. The breaking point occurred on Saturday, August 7th, during what should have been a routine posting of the week's production numbers, when Isaac had won again his 8th victory, a number that had come to symbolize both his remarkable output and his gradual devastation. However, when Drummond revealed the results this time, something unexpected occurred. Caleb, the young man who had been Isaac's closest rival, had won 3 times himself, and had been trying to outdo the older man by pushing his body to its limit, came forward with a challenge. "The numbers are wrong," Caleb said, his voice echoing through the crowd. "I picked more than Isaac this week." "I know I did." "The scales don't lie, Caleb. Isaac brought in 412 pounds and you had 397 pounds. "Then the scales are rigged," Caleb yelled back, his voice rising with desperation and anger. "I counted every pound." Drummond's face went white. The moment was precarious because direct challenges to white authority, even that of an overseer, usually resulted in harsh punishment. However, Caleb had been forced to go beyond the instinct for self-preservation and the meticulous calculations that typically guided enslaved people's resistance. "Or someone was altering the numbers, because I won't lose to him again." I can't. Isaac, sensing the danger, attempted to defuse the situation by saying, "Brother, the numbers are what they are. There's no dishonesty here. You worked hard, but do not call me brother," Caleb growled, turning against Isaac. Had broken something essential in him. In some ways, the reward was more important than safety or survival itself. Suddenly, with rage, the assembled crowd went silent, appalled at the unadulterated passion on display. "You're not my brother. You're my rival. You're the man between me and the only thing in this hell that makes me feel human, and I will not let you have it again." Constance's system had produced this, men who were so desperate to get her attention that they had betrayed one another entirely, that the ties of solidarity and mutual pain had disintegrated into acrimonious rivalry. Knowing that things were getting out of hand, Drummond took a decision that would have disastrous consequences. "Calm down, you two. It's not." However, everyone was astonished when Caleb sprang at Isaac before he could finish. They started fighting as soon as the younger man's fists made contact with Isaac's face. Not the ceremonial fighting that occurred occasionally among enslaved males. These incidents were carefully monitored to prevent major harm, but they were real acts of violence motivated by psychological collapse and urgent necessity. They were hurriedly separated by other men, but the harm had already done. Isaac's face was covered in blood and his nose was shattered. Caleb's eyes were filled with a frenzy that suggested he had completely lost all sense of reason, and his knuckles were split. Drummond was aware that this could not be concealed or covered up with tactful discipline. Dozens of people witnessed this public disturbance of order, which called for a public response. He was forced to present both men to Constance for assessment. Constance, wearing a look of manufactured worry, listened to Drummond's account of the occurrence in the main house parlor. Caleb and Isaac were in front of her. Isaac's face continues to bleed. With lingering anger and fear of punishment, Caleb trembled. "This is really disappointing," Constance stated in a tone reminiscent of a parent reprimanding their children. "I've given you incentives to better your work and your circumstances, as well as rewards for achievement, and you've responded with accusations and aggression." Mrs. Isaac started, but Constance interrupted him by holding up a hand. "I will not put up with such conduct," she added. "Your charges against Drummond, Caleb, point to a disrespect for authority that will not be tolerated. Isaac, even though you were attacked, this circumstance was brought about by your persistent victory." Well, the reasoning was skewed, accusing both men of causing the catastrophe that Constance had planned herself. But it worked for her, keeping her in charge while avoiding accountability. Constance stated in a chilly voice that Caleb would receive 15 lashes as a demonstration for everyone tomorrow, Sunday. "You won't be able to get Saturday rewards for the upcoming month, Isaac. Maybe that will lessen the tensions your success has caused and give others the chance to succeed." The penalties were carefully selected. Everyone would be reminded of the repercussions of defying authority by Caleb's lashing, which would encourage traditional discipline. Isaac would be keen to recover access to the benefits after being excluded, which would increase rivalry among others. The one thing that had given him a sense of humanity. Constance, however, had underestimated the extent of the misery she had caused. Caleb didn't go back to his cabin that night. Rather, he slid away in the direction of the river, his psyche shattered by the knowledge that the Saturday prize would never come again, and that the one thing that had made him valuable was now irrevocably denied. The following morning, they discovered his dead floating in the Alabama River. Nobody knew for sure if he had planned to get out and drowned in the process, or if he had strolled into the water on purpose in search of the only escape he could find. However, his passing increased the overall fatality rate among male field workers at Belhaven to 18 in just 6 months, a figure that could no longer be attributed to chance or natural causes. As he examined Caleb's body, Dr. Caldwell had had enough. He promptly sent a letter to the county medical board outlining his worries regarding the death pattern at Belhaven and making it clear that he thought Mrs. Greer's management practices, regardless of their precise nature, were causing an unusually high death rate. Within days of the letter reaching the medical board, Preston Greer's previous probe gained fresh immediacy. A formal report from a doctor could not be written off as anonymous accusations or family rivalry. It required an official answer. Despite Constance's protests, Preston Granger was appointed as the family's representative when a delegation led by 2 members of the county medical board arrived at Belhaven. Sheriff Holbrook on August 15th. This time, they arrived with the legal right to carry out a comprehensive investigation, which included looking through any confidential documents related to worker welfare and plantation management. Constance was aware right once that this degree of scrutiny would overwhelm her well-built barriers. The cleansed first glance at the journal on her writing desk might be deceiving, but a thorough analysis by several people would reveal its shortcomings. She was unable to respond to inquiries without disclosing the truth. At that moment, she made a choice that exemplified the brutal calculation that had underpinned all of her acts. She would be in charge of the story around the system's exposure if it were to happen. She would acknowledge enough facts to appear helpful, while framing her behavior in the most tenable manner conceivable. "I think I understand the worries that have led you here, gentlemen," she began, assembling the delegation in her parlor. "Maybe it's time for me to talk more candidly about my management techniques, which have been successful but are obviously misinterpreted." She went on to explain a variation of her Saturday incentive scheme, admitting that she had given the most productive employees individual attention, portraying it as a lonely widow's effort to keep spirits up by showing compassion. She acknowledged that some males could have been overly serious about this attention, had claimed that this was never her objective, but they fought too hard to get her approval. "All I wanted was to recognize their humanity," she explained with precisely the right amount of passion, to demonstrate to them that good work would be rewarded with considerate treatment and recognition as unique people rather than just workers. "If my approaches were out of the ordinary, it was because I thought that kindness could do what cruelty could never." In a brilliant performance, she presented herself as kind but unsophisticated, sincere but eventually failing in her attempt to manage humanitarian affairs. She didn't mention the publication in which she calculated the expected death rates from the systematic psychological exploitation that she had found acceptable. The delegation's responses varied as they listened. Her seeming regret moved some people. Others were still doubtful, but they were unable to demonstrate intentional malice as they did not have access to the secret journal or enslaved laborers' testimony that would be legally significant. Preston, though, was not content. He insisted, "Where's the journal?" With wide eyes and a confused expression, Constance said, "The one where you documented these methods in detail." She pointed to the clean book on her desk and remarked, "I have my plantation management journal. It only includes weather observations, crop rotation records, and production notes." Preston pressed, "That's not the journal I mean. I am aware that you maintained thorough records of your incentive program and your observations regarding specific employees." "Yes, I did make mental notes," Constance said with ease. "Every competent manager keeps an eye on her staff, but I have Preston. No secret diary. I believe you've let your imagination go wild." Constance's rooms were searched, but nothing was found. Upon closer inspection, the sanitized journal included just what she had stated. Notes on routine plantation management. The methodical documentation stated in Isaac's letter was not supported by any evidence. Preston nevertheless had one last move. Under conditions that could encourage more candid testimony, he asked permission to question enslaved workers once more, this time with the medical board present. After the delegation gave their consent, they assembled in the plantation office that afternoon to question each employee separately. The majority gave the same evasive acknowledgments. Indeed, there were incentives for hard labor. Indeed, a few men had overexerted themselves. No, there had been nothing wrong. The risk was too high, and the fear of speaking honestly persisted. Ruth, the housekeeper who had seen so much from her job in the main home, was then called. And Ruth, who has spent months witnessing men ruin themselves because she knows about the secret journal hidden beneath her. The cabin floor made a decision, because she could no longer endure the weight of complicity. Ruth murmured softly, her eyes sad, "There's a journal." Mrs. Granger documented everything in a leather-bound book, including the Saturday prizes, the actual rewards, her offerings to the men, their reactions, and their willingness to go above and above. She documented everything as if they were test subjects. There was silence in the room, to conceal themselves from me when Mr. Preston began his investigation. Told me that if I ever mentioned anything, she would sell my kids south. However, I am no longer able to keep this secret. Too many men have lost their lives. Sheriff Holbrook was sent right away by the delegation to Ruth's cabin to collect the journal. Constance sat motionless and mute, Preston barely holding back his vindication, and the wait seemed to go on forever. Regardless of the result, Ruth shuddered, knowing that she had probably sealed her own doom. The truth was undeniable when Holbrook returned with the leather-bound journal, wrapped in a jar just as Ruth had described. The members of the medical board read aloud records that detailed Constance's methodical exploitation in her own words, including forecasts of mortality rates that were considered acceptable prices of greater output, the calculated promises of intimacy, and the observations that elicited the strongest responses from men. Isaac will push himself to death for recurring access because he is appreciative, almost worshipful and helpful. Caleb reacts favorably to praise because he is a creature of validation. Biggest potential gain in productivity. If current rates continue, 17 deaths are predicted by August. Acceptable losses compared to the anticipated 47% increase in yields. The words lingered in the atmosphere, unquestionable proof of the willful exploitation of people used as test subjects to determine the extent of agony that could be wrung from humanity's promise. Preston had expected something like this, but as he listened, he felt nauseous. He had underestimated the severity of the reality that Constance's exact handwriting captured. Loneliness, yearning, or even plain cruelty had not motivated her. She had been experimenting with the mechanics of exploitation and found that the desire for attention may be more lethal than any physical discipline. Due to the unusual nature of Constance's offenses, the aftermath of the journal's discovery proceeded with the sluggish machinery of Alabama justice in 1841. No written law had been broken by her. There were no laws that prohibited giving gifts to slaves or that forbade having intimate relations with someone who was one's property. Because enslaved individuals were both regarded as property and as persons under criminal law, depending on which interpretation benefited white society, the very structure of slavery created a legal vacuum around such actions. Constance's techniques were formally denounced by the county medical board as being against Christian morality and appropriate management practices. However, censure did not equate to prosecution. For weeks, the issue of what specific accusations could be made against her stalled the legal system. Frustrated by the lack of action from the law, Preston sought another remedy. Citing her proven indifference to the monetary worth of enslaved property, he filed a legal suit to have Constance deemed unsuitable to administer the estate. The 18 fatalities amounted to a substantial capital loss. This argument, after all, had weight in the perverse economics of slavery that moral arguments could never have. The civil case continued throughout September and into late August. With the help of mobile attorneys, Constance put up a defense that admitted her tactics were unusual, but maintained they had served their main objective. Unprecedented output had prevented Belhaven from going bankrupt. Even while the fatality rate was unfortunate, her lawyers contended that, when accounting for the intensity of work needed during the busiest harvest season, it was not appreciably greater than what happened on other estates. The argument had some legal merit, but it was ruthlessly calculated. Owners of plantations were typically granted a great deal of discretion in management choices, and in the agricultural sector, productivity was, in fact, the key indicator of success. Her techniques were unorthodox but not necessarily unlawful, because Constance had attained this productivity through psychological exploitation rather than physical abuse. However, the public sentiment had shifted sharply against Constance, especially among the planter class, not because they were appalled by the exploitation itself. Because she had transgressed basic social norms. The entire institution of slavery was based on exploitation. The entire planter class was in danger when a white woman purposefully had sex with enslaved males, conceptual framework that supported white supremacy and slavery. At church socials and dinner parties, Constance was criticized in whispered talks for her impropriety and devaluing herself, as well as all white females, rather than for her brutality. In the end, this societal pressure achieved what the legal system was unable to. Constance consented to a settlement in late September, knowing that she would be completely shunned by Alabama society, and that her reputation would probably prevent her from doing business in the future. Preston Granger would take over Belhaven's management, and she would accept a little payment in return for permanently leaving Alabama. Preston would be compensated for taking on managerial duties, and any outstanding debts would be paid off with the proceeds of the plantation's sale. Constance never came back to Wilcox County, instead leaving for New Orleans, where her past remained unknown. The destiny of Belhaven's enslaved inhabitants was also unknown. The majority were sold to other properties across the Black Belt in October, As part of the plantation's liquidation, communities were scattered, families split up. The short-lived, terrible Belhaven experiment was absorbed into the larger system of slavery. One of those sold was Isaac, who was bought by a planter in nearby Dallas County who had heard about his exceptional output, but had no idea of the strategies that had led to it. Isaac did his best effort in his new role, but never went above and above. Together with the perverse rewards that had fed it, the fire that had propelled him to unachievable heights went out. Constance vowed to retaliate against Ruth, whose evidence had revealed the truth. As a kind of retribution for betrayal, Constance made sure Ruth's children were sold to a merchant bound for the Deep South before leaving Alabama. Ruth never saw her children again and spent a further 32 years in servitude. The cost she incurred for challenging authority. The overseer who had run Constance's system, Silas Drummond, was out of a job anywhere in the area. Regardless of his true guilt, no plantation would employ a man connected to such a controversy. He finally drifted west toward Texas territory after leaving Alabama, and he was never heard from again. The final investigation was initiated by Dr. Ephraim Caldwell, whose complaints to the medical board had prompted it. He continued to practice in Wilcox County, but he never again discussed the Belhaven case in public. He believed that the entire situation was proof of the corrupting effect of slavery on human morality, according to his private notebooks, which were found after his death in Deondow in 1867, that a system based on treating individuals like property would unavoidably lead to chances for exploitation that are only constrained by the conscience and imagination of the individual. Under a different name, Constance Granger herself disappeared into New Orleans society. According to unverified accounts from the 1850s, she had remarried to a rich businessman who was unaware of her previous relationships and led a comfortable life, till she passed away in 1853 from yellow fever. History does not document whether she felt regret for the 18 men who lost their lives while chasing her calculated rewards. After selling the property in pieces and paying off the debts that had pushed Constance to her extreme experiments, Preston Granger took charge of Belhaven's ruins. Although he made a small profit from the liquidation, he never mentioned his sister-in-law other than to caution other planters against cutting-edge management strategies that go against the natural social order. For decades, Belhaven's final season's output records, that unthinkable 47% increase, were kept in plantation archives, examined by agricultural specialists who wanted to know what techniques had produced such remarkable yields. However, official statements purposefully omitted the real reason: the psychological abuse that had caused those figures. A warning to planter families about the perils of letting women run plantations without adequate male supervision, the narrative became into a whispered legend. Sometime in the 1850s, the leather-bound journal, the most incriminating proof of Constance's systematic exploitation, went missing from government custody. According to some historians, family members attempting to preserve the Granger name purposefully destroyed it. Others speculate that it might still be around, concealed in a forgotten archive or private collection, just waiting to be uncovered. What we are certain of comes from bits and pieces: court records, private correspondence, Dr. Caldwell's personal writings, and the testimony that was kept on file by the medical board. These works depict a human exploitation experiment that exposed unsettling realities about the system of slavery itself. Constance Granger had found that traditional roughness was not as effective as the promise of dignity and recognition in controlling human beings. She discovered that people may be driven to self-destruction more effectively by their desire for humanity and acceptance of their value than by any kind of punishment or restraint. In her research on maximizing productivity, she used human misery as data points and meticulously documented this discovery. Belhaven was terrifying because it exposed the logical extremes of the enslavement system, not because it was an anomaly. Every part of a person's humanity could be used as a weapon for financial gain if they were considered property. Simply put, Constance were shrewd enough and merciless enough to know which weaknesses could be most successfully exploited. The stories of the 18 men who perished at Belhaven, Joseph, Daniel, Caleb, and 15 more whose names only show up in mortality records, were lost to time and became historical footnotes. They were guys who worked themselves to death, seeking fleeting moments of being treated like people instead than property, and who reacted with frantic hope to the promise of dignity. Although their tragedy was not specific to Belhaven, it was documented in a way that was unique, thanks to Constance's clinical observations and the accounts of individuals who saw the impacts of the system. In the ensuing decades after the Civil War devastated despite efforts to restore Southern culture through the plantation system and Reconstruction, the Belhaven story remained concealed because it was too upsetting to fit neat narratives about the cruelty or paternalistic goodness of slavery. It was a parable that implied that calculated intelligence applied to human weakness could be the source of the worst exploitation, rather than hatred. The area that was previously Belhaven has since been developed and split. Long ago, the plantation home was destroyed. The areas where men used to fight for lethal prizes are now home to contemporary residences and retail establishments. What transpired there is not marked by a historical marker. The system Constance Granger developed is not explained in any museum exhibit. However, the story endures in Wilkes County's archives. In the incomplete historical records that have survived intentional concealment, it continues to serve as proof of what happens when strength and desperation collide, when cunning and brutality are combined, and when humanity's promise is turned into a means of exploitation. The query that persisted in Dr. Caldwell's subsequent works to strike a chord: was Constance Granger a special kind of villain? Or was she just more forthright than her peers regarding the workings of slavery? Did she just reveal anything, or did she produce something new? What had always existed under a system that treated people like property? There is nothing cozy about history. Responses: only the unsettling documentation of what transpired when one woman, confronting social extinction and financial devastation, found that the human urge for approval may be more deadly than any physical discipline ever developed. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think all of this was disclosed, or are there any more sinister mysteries concealed within the soil of Alabama? Comment below and express your opinions. Subscribe if you would want to receive future historical mysteries that test our comprehension of the past. Visit this channel, press the alert button, and forward this video to a person who understands the complicated and sinister aspects of American history. It is necessary to tell and remember these tales, because we can only comprehend the present by facing the complete reality of our past. See you in the upcoming video as we unearth yet more history that isn't going to be forgotten.